Okay, so we should be recording.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the first Historical Roots of Our Time lecture for this current year. Titled Caste and Race, Interconnected Yet Distinct Systems of Oppression. Today, we're very honored to have a chance to talk with one of our colleagues, Jeremy Rinker in the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies, and Gaurav Pathania, who's a Assistant Professor of Sociology and Peacebuilding in the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University. This is a special occasion, particularly lucky to catch Jeremy before he goes off to India to lecture on the same topic on a Fulbright, which will be during this current spring semester. So I think I'm going to turn it over to our speakers now.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And I'm happy to have my colleague Gaurav here with me. We're friends for a few years now, and happy to have him joining in from Eastern Mennonite University. And his background and experience is deep. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass to you to kind of do a little framing of caste, Gaurav, and then I will jump in. Our plan today is to kind of have a few questions that focus. Some of those questions were on the flyer that some of you might have seen, that kind of focus down and trying to kind of parse out what are the distinctions, differences of these different systems of oppression, and how do we talk about them in our daily lives. And let me just say this before I think I'll jump in before I pass to you to talk about race and caste and kind of the distinctions. One of the reasons I wanted to do this semester is that this semester in the UNCG Faculty Senate, there is a resolution coming up. I don't have a resolution number yet, but it's a resolution on adding caste to our policy documents on discrimination. It's currently not there. This has happened around the country here in the US. California is leading the way. There was actually a Nepali low caste guy, Prem Periyar, who took a social work degree at UC East Bay and passed through that school to add caste to their documents and their policy documents related to discrimination. And it then went to the UC system. So the entire University of California system has now also passed that. It really started at one small school, UC East Bay near San Francisco, and then moved to the entire system. It's the largest state system in the country. So it's like a big thing in the anti-caste world. People are talking about it, and there's a movement around afoot, if you will, around the country to do this same thing. So I wanted to begin to start to have conversations around race and caste in order to kind of educate people about what is caste and understanding how it doesn't really fit our current protected categories, particularly when it comes to national origin and religion, which are oftentimes what higher caste people will say, oh, well, aren't they already protected under those protected categories? And in our legal system, we don't really have that protection, as we've kind of seen in California play out a bit. So with that, that's the kind of backstory, if you will, for why I was hoping to do this now before I leave to go on a Fulbright. And I am actually teaching a class right now, which has been fascinating, called Caste in India. And it's a sociology class, and I'm not a sociologist. I'm a peace and conflict studies professor here at UNCG. And so I'm happy to have Gaurav along, who is a sociologist, to help us parse some of this out. So I'll pass off to you, Gaurav, and then we can kind of jockey back and forth talking about these issues.
Am I audible? Yes. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, James, for hosting this, and thank you, UNCG History Department. It's really a pleasure always talking about the issue that is so close to me and to many people who actually come from this understanding. So let me also, Jeremy had already pointed out some things about this comparison, and I think we will be discussing these, what is difference, what is similarity, and what are difference in terms of when you think of caste and race. Because many of the the folks here, I think, for many times, first time maybe hearing the word caste, and it's I talk to my colleagues also. It's like I think after Isabel's book, then now people are at least are familiar with the word caste, but as a system, that how does it place? So I just want to provide a 1 or 2 minute background that how without with historical understanding, then it's easy to actually compare it with any other global form of discrimination. But this where it is rooted, what is the historic root of this system? So as you know that the caste, like any other or many other or unlike many other global form of discrimination, it is actually sheltered or protected by the cover of religion. So you cannot actually dissociate a caste with a religion without religion. On the other hand, I think when you think of the slavery and the racism and all, it has a kind of different connotation. Historically, it has changed over a period of time, and you see different dimensions of racism existing in different continents. But caste has a very peculiar origination, basically, in where which is sanctioned and supported by the religious textbook. Now, when you look at this picture, which we have, it's the god Brahma. Many of you know. Who know a little bit about Hinduism. So God Brahma was the creator of the universe. So now this is the basic understanding of caste, which is written in Vedas and in Manusmritis and all these historic texts, Hindu texts. And the idea is that they say that Brahmin who is the topmost caste, are born out of head of Brahma. Now, and now, of course, nothing can be born out of head except the ideas. So here, these are all maybe like, you could also think in a very symbolic terms, but then it actually had a very practical implication, because the thing is, of course, it must be an idea, but then the way it is implemented historically for 2,500 years, and that structure, the manifestation of this image, actually you can see even in 21st century that's how it is still governed. So Brahmins are born out of head of Brahma, and Kshatriyas, who are the warriors, and here arms is representing the strength, the power. And so Kshatriyas has been the rulers, and Brahmins on the top has been in the providing the intellectual resources as a teacher and a priest. And then you have Vaishyas, Thais representing the Vaishyas, who are the business community, basically the merchant communities. And then comes the Shudras, which are born out of feet. Now, again, nothing can be born out of feet, but it's just an abstract imagination that whoever developed and come up with this idea. So now, top 3 caste, you see Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya. These top 3 caste are called the twice born caste. In a way, when you compare it with Christianity, you have the system of baptism here. So you baptize and you say basically new rebirth, and you have a now new life here. But here in this system of Hinduism, these 3 castes, which are called twice born caste, which are the purest caste, and only these 3 castes has the right to wear the sacred thread. And you must have known the sacred thread. I'll show you in one of the pictures. So sacred thread is only given to those bodies who belongs to those top 3 castes. And the Shudras, the 4th one, which constitute around 50% of the population of today's India, and also like 50 years ago. So this population is called the lower caste. Now this is called in sociology, we said the 4-fold division of society. Now on the bottom you see Dalit and outcast. They are not part of this caste system. they are outcast. That's what they call the untouchables. They live in the outskirts of villages, and they were not allowed to enter in the villages. And even in today's time, when you go to any village in India, and India lives 70% India lives in the villages. So when you enter in any village, you will see that structure has not changed. So people might have talked about that, oh, now everyone is educated and all, but when you go into village, you still have those same structure, that Brahmin lives in the center and the lower caste lives in the Dalits live in the outskirts. Now, one thing actually, of course, with reservation, with affirmative action policies and all, what things have changed is that now people are educated and all, and they are moving up to different ladders. So in a way, the class has changed. Now you will see a lot of Dalits and lower caste, outcast are into politics. They are presidents of India and many other posts. But it does not change their social status, because social status here, so don't get confused it with class system, because in the class you can change by getting education, by getting economic upliftment. You change your class. Say, for example, you are born a poor person and tomorrow you got a lottery and your class changed, right? Unlike caste, in the caste system, you could be the president of India, but then you or when you go back to village, you are still the same, a lower caste, the untouchable. It happened just a few years ago, 2 years ago, actually, the former president of India, who was coming from the untouchable, he went to a temple in southern part of India, and he was not allowed to enter because the temple rule says that untouchables are not allowed. The Shudras, Dalits are not allowed to temple, and he accepted it because he believes in this idea of Hinduism, and because this is how the things work. So now, quickly move.
Can I jump in real quick
Yeah.
before you slip this slide? I mean, I think this is the kind of common conception of caste, right? This fourfold caste system with Dalits, or outcasts on the bottom. And one of the things that gets very confusing about India is that each of these castes have subcastes. So the Dalits, the Dalit non-caste or outcast folks, there's 5,000 or 6,000 different Dalit castes, right? So it becomes like mind-blowing to try to figure out, well, hold on, how do these people fit within this hierarchical structure? And so as we kind of start to think about race and caste, I mean, there's obvious distinctions between race and caste. And so let's kind of jump into that question, Gaurav. I think that.
Oh, sure.
Sure.
And before I jump to that, then let me just also clarify that when you see the lowest one, the Dalits outcast, it actually is further divided into two segments, which you called nowadays, say, for example, the indigenous people or tribes. So there are two sections, the Adivasis and Dalit. Now, when you look at the indigenous people, they are not even living in the villages. They are far, far away in the forests. So, and there are still a lot of population which actually has no connection with the mainstream population. So that is also one thing. Yeah.
And when you're reading around this in India, it gets even more complicated because the scheduled castes are the outcasts or untouchables, and the scheduled tribes are what are called Adivasis or indigenous people, right? And so the Indian government has come up with, post 1980s, really, in the Mondal Commission, came up with their own categorization system, as opposed to calling them untouchables or Dalits or whatever other term you might come up with, one of their subcasts or whatever. They've come up with this idea of scheduled caste, or SC. So in Indian parlance, you often see SC and ST, scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, to describe these two groups, which are really outside of the caste system. And of course, in India, one of the modern contentions is what we would call affirmative action. They call reservations. And so when we talk of reservations in this country, we're talking of reservations for Native Americans, right? But in the Indian context, reservations really means a kind of positive form of discrimination. It's affirmative action, right? Providing in public sector jobs, providing access for these communities, scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. If you're categorized in that community, you do have abilities to slip into public sector civil service jobs. And civil service in India, of course, is the largest employer in the world, I think. I read somewhere the Indian train system, which is under the civil service, is at one time at least was the largest employer in the world anywhere in terms of the number of people they were employing. So the public sector reservations does have a huge impact, and it causes a lot of conflict and contention as well amongst higher caste people who don't get those quote privileges because this is a positive form of discrimination, trying to replace people in a system that's been hierarchically unequal for a very long time. Coming to kind of a more familiar thing for probably most of our listeners, this idea of race and racial discrimination. And you mentioned Isabel Wilkerson's book, and she's playing her, and also I would say Michelle Alexander prior to her wrote a lot about caste, racial caste. The racial caste system is the way that actually Michelle Alexander talks about it, and certainly Isabel Wilkerson as well. And so I was curious, to have a little bit of a conversation about, well, what are the distinctions between racial discrimination and caste discrimination? I mean, the obvious one is that you can see racial discrimination. I mean, people are different colored, right? And so you can, there's a visual marker of that discrimination. Whereas in the caste system, there is no visual marker. There are very dark-skinned Indians who are from the south of India who are high caste, right? And there are very light-skinned, it's vice versa. So the colorism of caste doesn't really play out in the same way. And that's kind of the more obvious kind of difference, if you will. I mean, for me, I study trauma and historical trauma. So I'm actually very fascinated with collective historical trauma. And one of the things I would say is similar is that it impacts that these kinds of systems, caste or race, impact the entire system, and that includes the oppressed and the privileged, right? We don't often realize that the trauma of caste or race really has an impact on white people or Brahmins too, right? Or higher caste people as well. And so I think that's one of the kind of similarities, but there are also fine distinctions and differences. So Gaurav, I mean, what would you add to that kind of how do they differ in social practice? As a sociologist, how does race and caste differ?
Oh, thank you, Jeremy. So I think, again, going back to the basics, that how to understand this difference, we need to also understand what defines caste, right? So as Jeremy said, that race has more of a visual marker, right? But what defines caste? You look at my skin color, and you will look at many other Indians. It's almost a similar skin color in the northern part. In southern part, is having the darker complexions, but they all look similar. They all have the similar facial features, and more or less the same skin color. But then what defines caste? So now here, if I go back to the basic, then you can also think of that how it is similar to race in many ways. But then what are the difference? I want to come to that. But let's see, there are these three, four things that I want to come there. What defines caste? One, of course, it is by birth. Right? Say, for example, I am born in a Dalit family, in an untouchable family. So no matter how educated I am and how much money I do and how global I am, but I cannot change my caste. I can change my religion, but I cannot change my caste. Right? So that is what. So it is by birth. So you are born and die in the same caste, and so this is by birth. Now, second is it's hereditary. That it because you always are coming from this dynasty, this particular caste group, and so in a way you follow that hereditary system. Third is that people who believe in the idea of caste, they believe in the purity of blood and purity of many things. Here I'm just giving the example of blood, but purity has so much meaning in the caste system. They want to maintain the purity of blood, of purity of place, purity of space, and everything. And that's how, when you read these holy texts, you will see that how Dalit or the lower caste, they are considered impure, and their body, their mind, everything is considered, and this is clearly defined in the holy text, that how these are the impure bodies, and you don't want to entertain them. So this is idea of purity that is so ingrained in casteist mind. Now, then there is a traditional occupation, which in many ways also similar to the racism, but here it's also changing. For example, when you look at that picture again, which I said, Brahmins born out of head, and it's also another way to look at the same picture, that these are all divided on the basis of occupation, right? So Brahmins, intellectual work, these arm, the physical work, and the other all the service work and all. Now, in the modern India, this traditional occupation has changed. For example, I gain education, I got a job, and I could change my profession. That is the flexibility that do I have. So, but because tradition also adds the status in your to your caste, and at the same time, there is when you go deeper and understand this phenomena, that how much caste system has changed because of the traditional occupation, you will find that most of these profession are there is a lot of exchange, there is a lot of change, but still there are some profession, and I will show you some of the picture that has not changed because they are linked with the very clear idea of impurity or pollution. So I'll come to that, but there is a lot of flexibility in traditional occupation.
Let
And
me jump
the
in.
final idea is endogamy. Sorry, Jeremy.
No, I don't want to cut you off because I think this is excellent. And I want to jump in though and say that it's interesting because I've been reading recently Romila Thapar, who's an eminent kind of ancient Indian. I mean, one of the things about ancient India and Indian history is that India was an oral culture, right? So written documents are not available. And really the earliest written documents, you mentioned the Manusmriti earlier, the Rig Veda, one of the earliest religious document probably anywhere in human history, was oral initially. And so one of the things that Thapar says in her writings from the 60s and 70s is that, and this is debated, but that really that kind of traditional occupations, or what they call varna, the occupational kind of distinctions of the caste system, were probably the initial origin of, and then birth maybe came later. And so certainly it's a mix of varna and jati, birth and occupation. But so there's really I mean, one of the things to also know about caste is just like Hinduism for that matter, is not a term that people in South Asia, in the subcontinent use. Caste actually comes from the 1500s when the Portuguese were sailing up and down the coast, the western coast of India, and had enclaves up and down the coast, and they were coming off their ships and trying to observe social practice and understand, what are we watching? How are people interacting? And for them, they said, oh, this is like casta, which is kind of a division within Portuguese society that was understandable to them. So as humans, we often try to understand the ununderstandable by something we do understand. And so we have a better understanding of race in the United States. So I think we attempt to try to like, oh, well, it's like race, right? We attempt to try to connect it to something, which is a normal human tendency, right? To connect it to something that we know. But even the term caste itself is not a term that you hear in India, right? Casta, I mean, you do now in more modern India, but that's really a perversion of a Western terminology to try to understand jati and varna, right? That are more kind of indigenous terms.
So thank you, Jeremy. That's more of a historicity about the caste. But as a matter of fact, that this is such a complex system. One example. Now I'm going back again. Now think of this traditional occupation again. And I'm talking about how tradition-wise, the occupation-wise, the caste has been defined as a pure and impure. Now I'm going back to to that same picture and showing you that when you look at, and I think Jeremy just hinted a little bit, as he said, there are thousands of castes. Now, to give you one example, now when you look at this top caste, Brahmins, which is only 3% of the Indian population, but ruling all the resources. So when you look at their formation, there are about 100 subcastes within Brahmins. And they're all given different occupation within Brahmins. And their occupation is what? Their occupation is priest. They're the priest class. So now in those 3%, there are 100 subcaste, and the lower or the lowest among those 100 Brahmin caste, the lowest one cannot marry or interdine with the other Brahmin caste. And the occupation that is decided, for example, the top caste Brahmin can have the purest rituals to do, for example, marriage, baptism, kind of, all the Upanayana sanskar. But the lowest one will do the rituals that are not as pure, like
And
death ritual.
And so
Yeah.
that is the other distinction between kind of a racial hierarchy, right? Is that in one of the things that Dr. Ambedkar, the kind of Martin Luther King of anti-caste activism, right? One of the things that Ambedkar talked about was what he called graded inequality, right? So it's not just high, low, and lower, but it's high, high, higher, low, low, lower, right? And so everybody within the system is kind of pushing down on the people below them and aspiring, kind of what Srinivas called Sanskritization, trying to aspire to, oh, I'm going to act like the Brahmin so that people will perceive me and perceive my social status in a way that's higher than I really am in the social hierarchy, right? And so that kind of idea of Sanskritization and a graded inequality, that's different than race, right? The kind of graded levels is much more complicated in the caste system, really, than in the racial hierarchy. And so I'm curious, like I'm going to come back to Isabel Wilkerson too, and the book that has been on the New York Times bestseller list, and just kind of curious, like your thoughts, Gaurav, about does kind of making those connections as a kind of racial caste system, are there things that are positive about that, and then there are things that might be negative about that kind of a framing of caste as a racial caste system, and kind of equating the two? What do you think?
This is a very, very powerful attempt by Isabel Wilkerson, because I think this is though it's not the first time that people are comparing it, there are so many other, but more of an academic one. But this is because a journalist writing, so, and it's a writings for a popular public, so it has wider audience. So in that way, I think we must thank Isabel for highlighting the issue and bringing it to the forefront. When she talks about, like, I wanted to just highlight some quotes from her writing. So when she looks at the caste, she said caste is the infrastructure of our division, or it's a powerful infrastructure that holds each group's in its place. So, and that is why I think looking at the caste as a structure and taking that as a framework to explain the ongoing discrimination in the US or anywhere else. And I think if I try to summarize the whole book, which is in one line, which would be when she says, oh, sorry, I'm just kind of skipping here. Sorry. There is the thing which I wanted to highlight is, sorry. Yeah. Here it is. Can you see? Okay, share screen.
I think your share screen went away.
Okay, here we go. So can you see now? What do you see? I can't see.
Huh? Yeah, I see your, at least I could see your, the questions again, the slides again.
Okay, so let me pull it again. This is basically, yeah, here we go. Now I lost you guys. Okay, here we go. Quickly, I'm sorry. Share screen. Oh. No, I should click share screen options. And no, share screen. Yes. Here we go. Now this would work. Right? Here we go. And so if we try to summarize the Isabel's one, this is what I would say. She says caste is the bones. and race is the skin. And then she goes on the class as well. But here for this lecture, caste is the bones. When she says it's because it's a thousands of years old structure. And when you compare it with race has actually been diluted so much in past, especially past 100 years. And then you have different forms of racism existing in the world. But when you look at the caste, that structure has not changed. That bone, that structure is so intact. And there are ways and strategies and procedures to keep that structure intact. And because it takes us to the idea that how the institutionalized caste system through the last point, which I didn't discuss, which if I go back through this last point, the idea of endogamy. I mean, now you see, when you look at the US context, you see there are millions of Indians who are living here. And it is so, it kind of baffles me that when they come here and they look at this structure here, or this society, which is actually compared to India much more egalitarian and much more, you have a kind of democratic sense here, and you see all kind of infrastructure that supports an individual, and there is a kind of sense of citizenship and all. When they go back, they don't take most of these good things, they don't take it back, and then they repeat that same structure again and again in the form of endogamy. Like, it is when you go to India, wherever you go to India, you open any English newspaper or any language newspaper, and when you open it in the weekends, there are thousands and thousands of matrimonials advertisements. And they are caste and subcaste wise. And who gives these advertisements? These are the educated people, because 30% of India doesn't even read newspaper, and they don't even know how to do this, because they do it in their traditional way. But it's the educated class who actually becomes part of this marriage market, and they end up marrying within their subcaste. And there are all these cases that we have very few cases of change where people actually do intercaste marriages, but this is one way to keep the system intact. And so I say that how a Brahmin marries a Brahmin and produces a Brahmin. You are not producing an Indian citizen, you are producing a caste being, and it keeps repeating. And then then the whole onus comes to the guy, that he has to now protect this hereditary, this system of caste. And there is no change in that. There is a change, very slight change, but those people who they have to leave that space where they come from. So I see cities like Delhi, Bombay, metro cities, where there are people who are doing some kind of intercaste marriages, because Ambedkar said that this is one way to annihilate caste, to dismantle caste, that you don't follow. Because if you believe now, especially, and this argument is more valid in democratic India, in modern India, because our constitution says that we are all equal. We are equal citizens of this country, and we all believe in equality. So then, if we all believe in equality, then why do we end up marrying within our subcaste? So, and that is why I mean it's a big claim, but I say that some people laugh at it. I said the idea of love is completely bogus in Indian context, because how come the upper caste end up falling in love with the same caste group? Why, if the love is such a universal idea, that, or even the love at first sight and all those ideas, it just exists in a very very bogus state in India. So that's why I say that if you marry within your subcaste, you fall in love. But if you truly if you are open, or if you open yourself to everyone, then you rise in love.
Right. If you marry outside of, I'm glad you brought in endogamy, because I think that's of course, the way in which the system, as you said, perpetuates itself and maintains itself. And so trying to break those kind of social norms and the social ostracism that comes with, if you intercaste marry, there's a lot of blowback that couples are going to get for doing that, right? And so part of the reason I think that people get on shoddy.com and get on the newspaper and do that is because they don't want to deal with that social ostracism, and they're in, and it's kind of become ingrained in their system of thinking, as you said, and that is the way to annihilate it, because that's the structure that perpetuates it. What do you think? I mean, so we've identified some ways in which they're similar, race and caste, and which they're different. What do you think about solidarities that exist between anti-race and anti-caste activists? And are there tensions in those solidarities? Because like I was thinking from a historical perspective, as I was thinking about that question, there's a long history. I mean, Ambedkar and W.E.B. Du Bois wrote back and forth letters to each other, right? So there's a long history. The 1970s, we had the Dalit Panthers, which were very much influenced by the Black Panthers, right? Even though they never really met personally, there was a close connection in thought. We could even go back to the 1950s in the Bandung Indonesia conference, in which Asians and Africans came together, and the historian Vijay Prasad writes very eloquently about the Bandung conference and what this kind of Afro Asian solidarity, right? So there's a history of that. And Isabel Wilkerson's not the first one to write about it. Of course, there were studies in the 1940s in the South. Dollard, and I'm trying to remember the name of the other. There's a couple studies in the South of the United States that were equating the two castes. And so like there's certainly solidarities, but I'm like thinking, but there's also certainly differences, right? And so what's your take on like how to build those solidarities? Where can anti-caste and anti-race activists come together? And where do they differ? What do you think?
Yeah, and where do they differ and where do they actually meet? So I have been part of some of these solidarity forum, like we got to know that in Asia, Japan and Korea. Of course, Korea is hard to tap into, but Japan especially had one community called Burakumin who faces a very similar kind of untouchability system that in India Dalits faced. And then there are people in Nigeria, and there's also another one I forgot to mention here is Roma tribe that actually is facing similar kind of exclusionary system, that social exclusion. So that is in Europe. So we have actually made all these alliances, and the idea is that we not only share this form of discrimination, but there's also we share a similar kind of history. It could be in like when you apply the idea of slavery in India. Dalits have been, or the lower caste, the entire lower caste, which is the Shudras and Dalits, have been slave to the upper caste for thousands of years. And there was like when we also when we compare race and caste or the slaves and Dalits, there are many things that actually that needs to be taken care of. For example, when there is a slave trade happen, so the slaves had there was a value assigned to a slave, because slave could be bought and sold, right? So there is a value assigned, at least so there was some value assigned to the slave. But when you think of the Dalits, they have been there was no buying and selling. They have been just used as a tool or as an object. And if Dalit dies or if an untouchable dies, no one cares. So in a way, that's the difference, that there was no value even assigned to them until the Constitution was written, when Ambedkar said that now we are having the right to equality. Before 1950, there was no even a value assigned to this community. In the same way, when you look at these solidarities, I think this is solidarity of the history, that is the history of slavery, and also all of us are also experiencing the colonial history. That is also one part of it, that where actually many ways, I mean, and that's where, and if we don't take account of this history, then there is a lot of possibility that the people who are in the position of power are always misusing the history for their sake. Now, for example, the major argument that most of the scholars in India are making, their writings, and also some of the Western scholars along with them they tend to blame the colonialism for the caste structure or the caste system.
Right. I
Which
mean, and I hear high castes make that argument all the time in India, right? That it's colonialism that's the cause, right? And it clearly colonialism did tweak the caste system and change it, just like race has evolved over time. Caste has changed and adapted to the current realities. So there is some truth to colonialism changing it, but being the cause of it is I think a false kind of argument and a false flag, if you will, for some of these Hindu nationalists in particular have been making that argument. I'm curious too, like in terms of going back to the solidarities, and I want to make sure we have time to open up for questions too, but I'm thinking about the 2001 UN Conference on Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Other Related Intolerance, and the ways in which Dalits activated to join that conference. Unfortunately, that conference happened right before September 11th. And so the document, I think, came out on like the 8th or 9th of September. And then September 11, 2001 happened. But this was a major UN conference in Durban, South Africa. And the Dalits kind of went and took the charge to try to add themselves to that conversation. And of course, the Indian government pushed back. And said, no, this isn't happening. This isn't something this doesn't equate in the same way. And so they tried to kind of squash those solidarities. But we know that many solidarities did come out of that interaction, right? And so I just wanted to add that piece of kind of more recent history to the conversation and think about ways in which, I'm interested in this comparison, and I'm fascinated by Wilkerson's book, right? And the kind of current discourse, but I also get a little nervous because I want people to understand there's a distinction, and the nuances of the distinctions are so fine that oftentimes people can use them to their in positions of privilege and power can use them to their advantage. And so, I mentioned earlier national origin and religious discrimination. A lot of kind of higher caste Hindus in this country have tried to push back against adding caste as a form of discrimination to discrimination documents by saying this is covered by religious discrimination, and by you bringing it up, you're discriminating against Hinduism, right? You're discriminating against me, and in this context of Hindutva nationalism in India right now, the kind of call of like you're anti-Indian, you're anti-national, right? And so that's the charge against many Indian diaspora people, right? Yourself.
So you brought the idea of religion here, and I want to add to this to our understanding that when you look at the struggle of Ambedkar, who was the sole person, single-handedly led this whole movement, and he was opposed by the entire Hindu community. On the other hand, when you look at the anti-race struggle here, anti-racism struggle here by MLK on the other hand was supported by the church, right? You can't imagine MLK emergence without the support of the churches, right? So that way, in a way, that's a distinction. But when you talk about solidarities, I mean, it is Ambedkar who gave us W.B. Du Bois. It's Ambedkar who gave us Franz Fanon and who gave us all those literature that we are relying upon. And then after Ambedkar's death, it was the Dalits activists who actually, not only formed Dalit Panther later, but then Dalit literature, which is inspired by the Black literature, Dalit feminism inspired by the Black feminism, and now recently we have Dalit Lives Matter movement that is going on, following the Black legacy, revolutionary legacy. So I think these are all the solidarity building up, and it also now there are much more now nuanced debate that you see in the form of caste, that now we are talking about the deep down stigmas and traumas that of course it is been highlighted in the academic writing, but now activists are also taking these issues forward and talking about that how can we actually make a healthy society casteless society, and we create those harmony and the love, the idea of love and all. So these are, I think, the form of, so solidarities are happening on many grounds, where caste, race, and also the other form, the recent, I think, I would say, as I'm closely following, that there is also uh, uh, the within the idea of race, the idea of color, that actually the colorism there is now, because most of the people, they say in race is not as an issue in Indian or subcontinent, but it's the colorism that is actually one of the prime category that people also try to define, that the discrimination based on the color. So that's one. So I think, so that's where I think when I look at these South Asian context especially, I would say race, caste, and color. So one cannot also ignore the color, though as I said, they all look the same color, but colorism is also one of the form of discrimination that we need to take care, because there is another unspoken belief system that people think that those who are from the darker skin are the lower caste.
Right.
That's another way to
Yeah,
kind
even though there's multiple examples of how that's not true, but this kind of sense of the laborers and the folks who are doing the hard labor are out in the sun, so their skin is getting darker, and therefore they must be lower caste, right? And the fair-skinned people are privileged and don't have that. So yeah, thank you for comments in the chat box, everyone. And I want to just kind of open it up for, we've dumped a lot. It's a complicated system. We've dumped a lot on you. And I appreciate people who are here. If you have questions, though, we'd love to kind of delve further. I mean, I have more questions that we didn't even get to on my list, but I knew that would happen. There's Ambedkar.
So this is the person who actually wrote our constitution, the first guy who actually came to the US and did his studies and went back to, then he studied in London. He was the most educated person that they could not ignore him, and he ended up writing the Constitution of India. And that's where we all have the right to equality. And he brought these three key words from the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. He was the student of John Dewey.
Yeah,
and
I was going to say that he's a fascinating character for historians who haven't heard of him. And in the West, unfortunately, he's not as well known as he is in South Asia, obviously. But yeah, first law minister of India, and studied with John Dewey at Columbia University in the 1920s. Fascinating. Just I mean, on multiple levels, a fascinating character, a person that lived in the world and had a huge impact, and in a way has been deified by the Dalit community. He resisted that himself while he was alive. People would kind of turn him into a deity, and he said, no, I'm not. And famously, I mean, the other piece for me, and the way I got interested and even learned about Ambedkar initially, was that he led the largest mass religious conversion anywhere ever in human history, not just in South Asia, anywhere. Like he in 1956, right 3 months before he passed away, unfortunately,
2 months.
converted to Buddhism. 2 months? Yeah, converted to Buddhism, right? And that conversion, he had said in the 1920s, actually, I was born a Hindu, but I won't die a Hindu. And so, as Gaurav said earlier, he didn't make a lot of friends with Hindus. A lot of Hindus didn't like him for statements like that, right? And for burning the Manusmriti, and he did some radical things, right? But the fact that he actually followed through with his statement that he wasn't going to die a Hindu, he converted to Buddhism, and in one day, between 500 and 800,000 people, estimate somewhere in that range, converted with him. And then since then, millions of people have converted after, right?
Yeah, and actually, just to last point, that the kind of politics that is going on around here, those who are those who are the promoter of Hinduism and all, and kind of reject Ambedkar on many grounds. I said, when you look at the Constitution, the Ambedkar's very popular slogan, which he gave to India, which is, I think, the most beautiful slogan that represents equality. He said, "We are Indians firstly and lastly," because we are a secular country. right? So but then, these people come, then they all bring again the religious notion and caste notion and all. So how can we actually go to that idea that where we actually share that as a brotherhood rather than, being Hindu or Muslims or all other caste being? Yeah.
Right. Heather raised her hand and then Jamie did too. So Heather, do you want to ask a question or jump in?
Sure. Although Jamie, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Jamie, you might have had your hand up first. Do you want to ask the first question?
No, I just wanted to thank Gaurav and Jeremy for giving their presentations and to open things up to everyone who had questions. I learned in grad school, I think it was a Nicholas Dirks talking about caste, and that seemed to have misguided me from grad school days down till today, because that was mostly the colonial origins of the caste system.
And James, I'm glad that you mentioned him. I met him. He came to my university, and Caste of Mind, the book he wrote. So to counter his idea, we started. So I'm running a group called Minds of Caste. So where we are dealing with the issues of mental health and trauma, and helping people who are, subject to this. So, but thank you. And again, highlighting the colonial history and all, I think, one of the argument that is going around, and we should definitely challenge it in academia and also in public. Thank you, James.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you as well. This was very interesting, and I learned a lot of new information. And I have two quick questions, I think. One is just that in my own research, which is on, to some extent, reproductive justice as an international movement, there's that desire for, the DNA of reproductive justice as a movement is a human rights framework, explicitly to sort of kind of, navigate around these limitations that come from sort of like the uptake of social movement in different locations, and especially like a privacy context of the United States legal system. So I just wasn't, that might be sort of I didn't know if that sort of language or that sort of paradigm is operating here in across some of the work that you're doing. And then the other quick question is that I have not watched the documentary Writing with Fire, but I've been meaning to, and sort of screening it as I'm an English professor and I teach writing and rhetoric, and as I've heard about it, I've thought it might offer some interesting insight into activism and advocacy. I teach classes. So I just wanted your hot take on if you think that it's a documentary that is, putting a good message that would, support some of the things you're working on here.
Yes, I'll jump in and then I'd love to hear Gaurav's take too. I actually saw writing. I'll start with the Writing with Fire. I saw it that UNC Chapel Hill put it on when it was on PBS, it's been about a year ago now, or 8 months ago or something. And it was quite interesting. They had Yersinia Dutt, the woman who wrote Coming Out as Dalit, journalist herself, as one of the panelists, and she was great. They also had a couple of faculty members, one of which was a higher caste Indian guy from the School of Journalism. It was the School of Journalism that put it on, and it was quite an interesting, he was talking, it was kind of like, whoa, it was really interesting to watch, because he was talking about how he made some comments that I was kind of like, I can't believe he just said that, kind of saying that like he had never experienced caste. Well, it's because he was coming from a very privileged position. And so it was a fascinating, the video itself though, yes, is a good example of kind of activism. And then back to the first question, my comment would just be yes. So I wrote a book, Identity, Rights, and Awareness, and I was trying to kind of deal with that issue of the human rights lens. And so I mentioned earlier the 2001 Durban conference. That is what the Dalit contingent that went to Durban was trying to do, was trying to frame it in a human rights perspective. There's some tensions around that for sure. And of course there was pushback from the Indian government, as I said, and others and even others at the conference who were kind of like, I think, somewhat confused. I wasn't there, and you probably have more perspective on this than I do, Gaurav, but I think there were people who were from other anti-racist movements around the world there, kind of kind of hesitant to lump the Dalit cause in together with this in this conference on racism and xenophobia and racial discrimination. And so they were very much trying to frame it. And I think there's a lot of activists who are trying to frame it in that way. I'll just say quickly, my book project was on a Dalit Buddhist movement. So really using religious perspective is actually on 3 different movements. One of those movements is very much a human rights organization and trying really 2 of those movements, but one of them in particular, really trying to frame the Dalit cause in a rights type of a perspective, which internally within anti-caste movement, I think there's a lot of kind of contention around that. There's kind of different perspectives about, I mean, I'm thinking, Gaurav, about BOMSEF, the Backward Caste Employees Federation, and their very secular kind of framing of the issue versus a group like TBMSG, which I studied, which is a Dalit Buddhist organization that's saying, no, we front our Buddhist identity. And the BOMSEF folks would say, no. And I I've told you these stories. I have a colleague who was very active in BOMSEF and an academic, an anthropologist. And I went to his house and I was kind of surprised. I was like, wow, you have Buddhist statues all over the place, And he said, yeah, what do you think I wasn't Buddhist? He's like, I just don't front that. That's not the way I'm going to organize people, right? So there's like a lot of distinction within the anti-caste movement about how to organize and mobilize. Agitate, organize, mobilize. That's the, the Ambedkarite, right? But how do you do that, right? So I don't know, Gaurav, did you want to jump in and say anything there?
Well, I think you said most of the things. You covered a lot of ground. So I think just to summarize, I would say that it is very unfortunate that caste system, which is an artificial construction of someone's mind, has been ruling the Indian subcontinent for thousands of years. And I think we forgot to mention that it exists in the entire subcontinent, from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, another worst country to talk about the casteism. So it is all over, and it exists in all the religion, because most of the people, lower caste people, in past 100 years, to get rid of the caste system, they converted to Christianity, they converted to Islam and Buddhism and Sikhism, the people of turban. So all of these religions, unfortunately, in Indian subcontinent, are reproducing the same caste system. And you don't find, Quran never talked about untouchability or caste, but you go to India, you have the official category called backward class Muslim or Dalit Christian. These are the official category, and so that discrimination basically going, and that's where religion plays a big role. That how it is actually keeps perpetuating. So the idea of supremacy never goes out of our brain. It's still, so in a way they said that casteism is the investment in keeping the hierarchy as it is, in order to maintain your own ranking, advantage, and privileges, to elevate yourself above others and to keep others beneath you. So this is also kind of I'm working on a project with Virginia Tech on understanding privileges. So these are all a privilege that actually people don't understand. Those who come here and go to these best educational institutions, but there is no consciousness of those privileges. And I think this is one of the appeal I have, that we need to be very conscious of our privileges. Like I always tell every friend I meet, I said, I am a privileged person coming from India because it's a patriarchal society. As a male, I'm privileged. As a casteist being, I must be the lowest one, but as a male, I'm privileged. So I need to recognize these privileges, and only then actually we can talk about change. So, thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you all. If there, I guess we're probably out of time. I mean, if there's I can stop the recording, or if there's other questions. What, Jamie?
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. We usually go for about an hour, but this is going to be posted now to the YouTube channel for the history department. And I hope we have an opportunity to talk again, and continue this conversation.
Yeah.
And also
Yeah.
to think about this for the spring, if you want to say anything about the spring resolution.
Yeah. So Faculty Senate at UNCG will have this coming up. I'm not sure exactly when in the spring, but it will be on the agenda and on the Faculty Senate side. And I hope to zoom in from India. I will be on a Fulbright to India, but I'm hoping, if it's not too crazy time difference, to zoom in and answer any questions or be there to help support and describe that. But then even after that, one of the things that the provost raised as this went through the Faculty Senate EDI committee, Amy, let's do this semester. I told the provost too, yeah, we're starting this, but I think this is, you can't educate somebody about a very complex system like this in one sitting or two sittings, right? It takes many, right? So hopefully this is just the beginning, and we can do more. And I'd love to have Gaurav come back. I'm sure that Gaurav would be willing to come back. I'm speaking for you.
Yes, no, definitely. This is part of our active. This is how we have to bring change in the system. Yeah. So
Right.
I'm always ready to do whatever is needed. So yeah, definitely. So we are doing all other kind of activism now. The legal activism is going on as well, and I'll also share separately with what we are doing currently next week actually. So there are a lot of activism, a lot of protests, and all those things. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for
your support.
I'm going to stop the recording now, but we can stick around if you want.